The police arrived within 20 minutes, as they always did in Thornfield, which was to say with deliberate efficiency rather than urgency, since nothing of genuine consequence had happened in the village for nearly a decade. Inspector Martin Graves was a man of 58, competent rather than imaginative, with the kind of methodical approach that served well for straightforward cases, but occasionally floundered when human psychology demanded more than procedural expertise. He stood on the terrace, examining the ring through a handkerchief, while his constable took preliminary statements, and the vicar attempted to shepherd the remaining guests into some semblance of order. Miss Marple remained seated in the marquee, unobtrusive, and apparently unmoved by the disruption. She had accepted a fresh cup of tea from young Margaret, the vicar's maid, and watched the proceedings with the patient attention of someone accustomed to observing life's darker currents. Around her, the other guests clustered in small groups, their voices pitched low, their eyes darting toward the terrace where Inspector Graves methodically documented the scene. "Extraordinary business," murmured Margaret Blackwell, a retired schoolteacher who had lived in Thornfield for 40 years and knew every scandal, every secret, and every suppressed truth with the precision of an archivist. She had positioned herself beside Miss Marple, drawn to the older woman as people often were, sensing in her a quality of understanding that required no explanation. Ronald Cathcart. I had almost forgotten we had such a person in our midst. Almost, but not quite, Miss Marple replied gently, setting down her teacup. One doesn't truly forget such things, does one? Even when years have passed and life has moved forward, there's always something that lingers. A name spoken, a memory triggered by an unexpected association. The human mind is rather like a garden. You can neglect a corner, but the plants don't cease to exist simply because you've stopped tending them. Margaret Blackwell regarded the elderly woman with something approaching awe, though she could not have articulated precisely why Miss Marple's observation struck her so profoundly. It was true, of course. Ronald Cathcart, despite his absence, had never truly left Thornfield. He existed in the town's collective consciousness as a ghost of sorts, not supernatural, but somehow more present in his mysterious absence than he might have been in plain visibility. On the terrace, Inspector Graves had turned his attention to the Ashworth family proper. Reverend Edmund, dignified and composed, stood beside his wife Constance, whose hands trembled visibly as she explained how she had noticed the ring only when the ball began to tip. Diana, meanwhile, had positioned herself slightly apart from Robert Winslow, though not so far as to suggest rupture, merely a degree of separation that spoke volumes to those inclined to read such silent communication. Robert himself maintained an expression of concerned civility, but Miss Marple noticed how his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when Inspector Graves asked Diana to confirm her acquaintance with the deceased. For Ronald Cathcart was, it seemed, to be pronounced officially dead, or at the very least presumed so. A man does not leave his signet ring in a bowl of garden flowers without some profound disruption to his circumstances. Constance was always rather theatrical, Margaret Blackwell continued, lowering her voice further. Though I shouldn't say so, but she can make a production of the smallest incident. I do wonder, though, if she truly discovered the ring by accident. The water bowl sits in exactly the same place each year. One might have noticed such an object during the morning's preparation, wouldn't one think? Miss Marple turned slightly to regard her companion with mild interest. You're suggesting deliberate placement? That someone arranged for the ring to be found at a specific moment? I'm suggesting nothing definitively, Margaret replied with careful precision, merely observing that Constance has always possessed a talent for drawing attention precisely when attention serves her purposes. And this discovery, today of all days when Diana is celebrating her engagement, does seem rather theatrically timed, doesn't it? Before Miss Marple could respond, Eleanor Blackwood swept past their location, her silk shawl trailing behind her like a banner. The widow had been one of the first to offer formal identification of the ring, having known Ronald Cathcart when he lived here, as she had phrased it with deliberate vagueness. Her movements possessed the controlled grace of someone whose wealth and status had long ago exempted her from the necessity of explaining herself. The police are quite overwhelmed, Eleanor observed, pausing only briefly. Inspector Graves has asked me to remain available for further questioning. It appears Ronald had certain connections I had not fully appreciated during his residence here. The inspector seems to believe this is a matter of some complexity." With that cryptic statement, Eleanor continued toward the house, leaving Miss Marple and Margaret in contemplative silence. The afternoon light had begun to shift toward the golden quality of approaching evening, and the garden, which had hosted such a pleasant gathering mere hours earlier, now seemed somehow altered. The flowers appeared less vibrant, the shadows deeper, and even the air itself seemed to carry a weight that hadn't been present before. Across the terrace, Inspector Graves was arranging to remove the broken bowl and its contents for more thorough examination. He had begun constructing a narrative, Miss Marple surmised, a logical sequence of events that would, in all likelihood, prove entirely insufficient, because the truth, in her long experience, was rarely as simple as it appeared to those who approached crime with conventional expectations. Someone in Thornfield had known where Ronald Cathcart's ring could be found. Someone had deliberately chosen to reveal it today. And that someone, Miss Marple reflected with the certainty born of 8 decades observing human nature, had possessed far more motive than anyone had yet acknowledged. By evening, the vicar's garden had been cordoned off with the sort of police tape that seemed to sever Thornfield from its previous existence, and Inspector Graves had established a temporary office in the vicar's study. The garden party's remnants, abandoned teacups, wilted napkins, a child's hat left behind, created a poignant tableau of interrupted normality. Miss Marple had returned to her cottage on the village green, a small stone house with climbing ivy and a garden that reflected her own methodical approach to life, and was preparing her evening meal when there came a knock at her door. It was Timothy Marsh, the farmer's son, red-faced and visibly agitated. Was perhaps 30 years old, sturdy in the manner of men who work the land, but his hands trembled as he stood in Miss Marple's sitting room, turning his cap over and over in his fingers, as though it might provide some answer to an unspoken question. "Miss Marple, that is to say, I felt I ought to speak to someone before the police begin their inquiries more thoroughly," he began, his words tumbling over one another in the manner of someone harboring a guilty secret. "About Ronald Cathcart. There are things that people don't know. Things that that several people might have neglected to mention to the inspector." Miss Marple gestured toward the armchair beside her own, settled into the familiar comfort of her knitting position, and regarded the young man with an expression of patient interest. "Please sit, and take your time. I find that when one attempts to hurry truth, it becomes distorted." Timothy sat, though perched rather than settled, and Miss Marple noticed how his eyes avoided direct contact. A sign, she reflected, not necessarily of dishonesty, but of shame or complicated knowledge. There was a distinction worth maintaining. "Ronald Cathcart and I had a falling out," Timothy began carefully, "years ago. We were friends once, you understand. Or rather, we ran in similar circles when he first came to the village. But there was a matter involving money. A loan, technically, though Ronald had been rather unclear about repayment terms. When I pressed him on it, he became evasive, and eventually he simply disappeared, without settling his debt." "How much?" Miss Marple asked, her needles clicking steadily. £200, a considerable sum in those days. "Indeed. And did you make this situation known to others?" Timothy flushed deeper. "I mentioned it to a few people. Nothing formal, merely conversation. But yes, word circulated. It was difficult, you understand, having been made a fool of. And then Ronald simply vanished, and everyone eventually forgot about it, and I was left with nothing but my own resentment." Miss Marple continued her knitting, allowing the silence to extend just long enough to be uncomfortable. "And now that his ring's been found, you wonder whether your long-standing grievance might appear to others as a motive for more decisive action than merely allowing the debt to lapse." The bluntness of the observation seemed to strike Timothy like a physical blow. He nodded, miserably. "I didn't do anything to him, Miss Marple, truly. I haven't seen Ronald in 5 years. But I'm afraid people will think, that is, I'm afraid the inspector will conclude." That you harbored sufficient resentment to act upon it, Miss Marple completed gently. Yes, I perceive your difficulty. The timing of your confession, however, works somewhat in your favor. Had you attempted to conceal this history, its eventual discovery would have appeared far more sinister. After Timothy departed, looking somewhat relieved but not entirely reassured, Miss Marple settled more deeply into her chair and allowed her mind to work through the implications. A financial dispute was certainly a motive, though not in her experience the most common cause of serious violence. Financial disputes, in her observation, more frequently resulted in legal action, social ostracism, or the slow accumulation of rancorous feeling that expressed itself in petty cruelties rather than dramatic violence. The door knocker sounded again not 20 minutes later, and this time it was Robert Winslow, the new headmaster. He was visibly uncomfortable, standing in Miss Marple's small sitting room as though the walls themselves might bear witness against him. His silver-threaded hair seemed more pronounced in the lamplight, and his careful politeness had developed a fragile quality, as though it might fracture at any moment. "I've come to speak with you rather than directly to the police," Robert said without preamble, "because I believe you have a reputation for understanding matters that others miss. It concerns Ronald Cathcart and Diana Ashworth." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused for the first time that evening. "Go on." "Ronald Cathcart and Diana were involved romantically before he disappeared. It was never acknowledged publicly. Diana was younger then, barely 25, but the relationship was significant enough that his sudden departure affected her deeply. She was quite despondent for several months afterward. I mention this because I wonder whether the discovery of his ring today, at the precise moment of our engagement, might be intended as some form of interference, some attempt to resurrect old feelings or old complications. "And you are telling me this why?" Miss Marple inquired mildly. "Because I love Diana, and I would not wish her implicated in whatever has befallen Ronald Cathcart, and because I suspect that the inspector, upon learning of her prior involvement with the dead man, may develop theories that are both damaging and incorrect." After Robert's departure, Miss Marple sat in the gathering darkness, her knitting abandoned on her lap. The evening had revealed far more than the afternoon's theatrical discovery. Ronald Cathcart, it seemed, had been a man whose absence was more complicated than his presence could ever have been. He had left behind financial entanglements, romantic complications, and various degrees of resentment that had festered quietly for 5 years. But the ring's placement, deliberate, theatrical, discovered at the exact moment Diana's new engagement was being celebrated, suggested something far more calculated than the simple consequence of an accidental death. Someone was telling a story. Someone was using Ronald Cathcart's ring as punctuation to a narrative that remained largely unspoken. And Miss Marple, with the certainty of long experience, recognized the signs of a murderer who possessed not merely motive but purpose. By the following morning, Thornfield had transformed into a village consumed by speculation. The news of Ronald Cathcart's ring had spread through the community like ink diffusing through water, and every conversation, every glance, every carefully neutral statement carried the weight of surprise. Said knowledge. Miss Marple emerged from her cottage to find the village green clustered with small groups of people engaged in the sort of intense discussion that occurred only when genuine crisis displaced the comfortable rhythms of daily life. She proceeded with her customary unhurried pace toward the village shop, aware that Martha Finch, who operated the establishment with the precision of a woman who missed nothing, would possess a comprehensive understanding of the morning's developments. "Miss Marple," Martha called out as the elderly woman entered, her voice pitched to carry both welcome and the implicit promise of significant information. "You've heard, I presume, about the discovery at the manor house." Miss Marple paused in the act of selecting several items from the shelf. "I have not yet heard any such thing, though your tone suggests it is of considerable importance." Martha leaned forward conspiratorially, glancing toward the other customer, Mrs. Helena Porter, who was examining the tea selection with elaborate concentration while clearly listening to every word. Eleanor Blackwood's gardener found Ronald Cathcart's leather jacket buried beneath the garden shed, nearly destroyed by time and weather, but unmistakable once cleaned. "And there's blood on the collar, Miss Marple. Dried blood, but blood nonetheless. The implications of this discovery hung between them like a physical presence. Eleanor Blackwood, the wealthy widow who had identified the ring, whose manor house sat on the elevated ground overlooking the village, had apparently been harboring evidence of far greater significance than a mere signet ring floating in a garden bowl. "Has Inspector Graves been informed?" Miss Marple asked calmly, placing her selections on the counter. "He's at the manor house now, this very moment," Martha confirmed, accepting payment for the purchases with the ARO. Someone dispensing information of state importance. Eleanor claims she knows nothing about how the jacket came to be on her property. Says her grounds are extensive and she rarely ventures into the less cultivated areas. But you know what people are saying? That Eleanor had dealings with Ronald Cathcart, unspecified dealings, and when he attempted to leave the village or make trouble, she arranged for his permanent silence. Miss Marple accepted her parcel and walked thoughtfully back toward her cottage, her mind constructing and deconstructing various narratives with practiced efficiency. The discovery of the jacket was troubling not because it provided clarity, but because it seemed designed to do precisely that, to create a false sense of solution while actually obscuring the true nature of events. Someone had wanted the ring to be found in the vicar's garden. Someone had wanted Ronald Cathcart's jacket to be discovered at Eleanor Blackwood's manor house. These were not random occurrences but deliberate placements, each carefully orchestrated to direct suspicion toward specific individuals. She found Constance Ashworth at the village post office when she stopped to mail a letter. The vicar's wife was agitated in a manner that seemed to exceed the normal bounds of community concern about a genuine crime. Her hands fluttered about her person like anxious birds, and her eyes darted constantly toward the door, as though expecting imminent accusation. "Miss Marple, this is absolutely dreadful," Constance began without preamble, abandoning any pretense of normal civility. "That poor Eleanor, having such a thing discovered on her property. Though I must confess, I always thought there was something rather peculiar about Eleanor's friendship with Ronald. They were quite frequently seen together before his disappearance. Long conversations in the garden, private meetings. You know how these things circulate through a village." Indeed I do," Miss Marple replied mildly, "though I also know how frequently village speculation diverges substantially from actual fact. Tell me, Constance, do you recall precisely what Ronald Cathcart did for occupation during his time in Thornfield?" Constance appeared momentarily disoriented by the question. Well, I'm not entirely certain, actually. He had some connection to London, something to do with investments or financial matters. He was fairly private about his employment. Private, or actually engaged in activities that were better left unexamined. The implication hung between them, and Miss Marple watched carefully as Constance's expression shifted from agitation to something approaching calculation. It was a moment of revelation, small but significant. The instant in which the vicar's wife's concern transformed from genuine shock to something more self-interested. By midday, Inspector Graves had detained Eleanor Blackwood for formal questioning, and the village had reached that peculiar state of excitement that occurred when someone of social prominence became entangled in official suspicion. Miss Marple received a visitor in the afternoon, Inspector Graves himself, who arrived with the sort of weary courtesy that suggested he had begun to recognize the inadequacy of his initial theories. "I understand you were present at the garden party, Miss Marple," he began, settling into her offered chair with the posture of a man unburdening himself of confusion, "and that you have a reputation for observing details that others miss. I wonder if you might have noticed anything unusual in the period preceding the discovery of the ring." "Many things were unusual," Miss Marple replied, offering him tea. "Though whether any of them relate to Ronald Cathcart's fate, I cannot yet determine with certainty. I see and tell you that someone wanted his ring to be found. Someone wanted his jacket to be discovered. Someone is constructing a narrative with deliberate care. But the question that troubles me, Inspector, is whether that someone is also the person responsible for his death, or whether they are attempting to conceal the true killer by directing attention elsewhere." Inspector Graves regarded her with newfound respect and increasing frustration. "You're suggesting this is more complex than it appears?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said carefully, that the most obvious solution is frequently the one that someone has taken considerable pains to make obvious. And in my experience, when an intelligent person takes such pains, it is generally because the truth is far more damaging to their interests than allowing suspicion to fall upon others would be. The following 3 days brought a peculiar stasis to Thornfield. Eleanor Blackwood remained, technically detained but not formally charged, existing in a legal limbo that prevented her from fully retreating to her manor house, while simultaneously allowing her sufficient freedom to torment herself with endless conjecture. Inspector Graves continued his methodical interviews, constructing a timeline that, while logical in its sequence, increasingly failed to account for certain discrepancies that Miss Marple had begun to notice with quiet deliberation. She spent considerable time in her garden during this period, ostensibly tending to her flowers but actually engaged in the far more demanding work of reconstructing events from fragments of testimony and behavioral observation. The jacket discovery troubled her particularly. Ronald Cathcart's garment, hastily buried but ultimately exposed, suggested panic and haste, yet the ring's placement in the vicar's garden suggested calculation and planning. These were not consistent with a single individual's state of mind, unless that individual had undergone significant psychological transformation between the two actions. It was Margaret Blackwell who visited her on the 3rd evening, bringing with her a piece of information that seemed to crystallize certain previously amorphous suspicions. Margaret moved with unusual agitation, her normally composed demeanor fractured by something approaching distress. "I've remembered something," Margaret began without preamble, settling into Miss Marple's sitting room with the familiarity of long acquaintance. Something I had quite forgotten until today, when I was reviewing old photographs. Ronald Cathcart had a younger brother who visited him twice during his residence in Thornfield. I only remember because the resemblance was quite marked, and there was some awkwardness about the visits, some family difficulty that was never fully explained. "And this brother's name?" Miss Marple inquired, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "I cannot quite recall with certainty, but I know he was employed somewhere in London, and there was some suggestion of business dealings between the two of them. I believe Eleanor Blackwood knew him as well, or at least knew of him." After Margaret's departure, Miss Marple sat in the deepening twilight and allowed the pieces to shift and reconfigure themselves. Her brother suggested not merely Ronald's isolated presence in the village, but a connection that extended beyond it. Her brother suggested potential inheritance, potential rivalry, potential motivations that transcended the simple resentments of Timothy Marsh or the romantic complications surrounding Diana Ashworth. The following morning brought the first genuine break in the investigation, though it manifested in a manner far more subtle than Inspector Graves appeared to recognize. A bank manager from the near Est town arrived at the police station with records indicating that Ronald Cathcart had maintained an account in Thornfield under a false name, and that substantial sums had been transferred through this account in the months preceding his disappearance. The amounts suggested something far more significant than investment advice or ordinary financial management. "It appears," Inspector Graves explained to Miss Marple during another of his increasingly frequent consultations, "that Ronald Cathcart was involved in some form of illicit financial operation. Possibly fraud, possibly worse. His brother, a man named Charles Cathcart, appears to have been his partner in whatever scheme was underway." "And has Charles Cathcart been located?" Miss Marple asked. "That's the difficulty," Graves admitted with evident frustration. "Charles Cathcart has been dead for nearly 4 years. A motor accident in London, officially recorded as accidental. But given what we're now uncovering about Ronald's activities, one begins to wonder about the accuracy of that determination." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, her needles clicking steadily. "One does begin to wonder. Tell me, Inspector, what was Eleanor Blackwood's relationship to these financial arrangements?" "That remains unclear. She claims ignorance of any illegal activity, though she admits to knowing Ronald socially and to discussing investment opportunities with him. We're examining her financial records now, but so far we've found no evidence of direct involvement." "No evidence of direct involvement," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "But perhaps evidence of indirect benefit. If Ronald Cathcart was engaged in fraudulent schemes, And if those schemes had benefited Eleanor Blackwood in ways that might not appear obviously connected, she would have possessed a motive to silence him before discovery. Precisely, Graves said, eager. Which is why we're pursuing the theory that Eleanor, learning of investigations into Ronald's activities, arranged for his elimination to prevent exposure. Or, Miss Marple said carefully, Eleanor discovered the truth about Ronald's activities and, rather than involve herself in scandal, simply allowed him to disappear of his own volition. And someone else, someone with far greater at stake, arranged for his permanent silencing. That afternoon brought another visitor, Timothy Marsh, but transformed from the agitated young man of 3 days previous into someone of considerably greater composure. He carried with him a piece of documentation that he presented to Miss Marple with barely concealed satisfaction. "I've had my solicitor investigate my father's financial records," Timothy explained, "because I suddenly recalled that my father had received a substantial payment several years ago, ostensibly for land consultation, but actually coinciding with Ronald Cathcart's most active period in the village. My father never explained the payment, and I had forgotten about it entirely until the news of Ronald's involvement in financial irregularities emerged." "And what conclusion do you draw from this?" Miss Marple asked, though she suspected she understood precisely what Timothy had discovered. That my father may have been complicit in whatever Ronald and his brother were doing. That he accepted payment for his silence or his assistance. And that when Ronald disappeared, my father simply accepted the situation rather than risk exposure. "Has your father explained this payment?" "He refuses to discuss it," Timothy said quietly. "But he's been increasingly anxious since the ring was discovered. Yesterday he suffered what appears to have been a minor heart episode. The doctor says the stress is taking a toll on him." After Timothy departed, Miss Marple sat in profound silence, allowing the implications to settle like sediment in still water. The case was becoming increasingly clear, though not in the manner Inspector Graves had constructed. The ring and the jacket were not evidence of Eleanor Blackwood's guilt. They were evidence of something far more deliberate, a carefully orchestrated revelation designed to direct attention away from the true culprit and toward a convenient suspect. Someone had killed Ronald Cathcart. Someone had buried his jacket. And someone, with calculated precision, had arranged for discovery of these items at moments designed to implicate Eleanor Blackwood. But the person who had placed the ring in the vicar's garden on the afternoon of Diana's engagement, that person possessed a level of psychological insight and ruthlessness that suggested they understood precisely how to manipulate public opinion and police investigation. Miss Marple rose from her chair and retrieved her coat. It was time, she decided, to have a far more direct conversation with certain individuals whose motivations had become considerably clearer. Miss Marple's first destination was the vicar's house, where she found Constance in the garden, ostensibly engaged in deadheading roses, but actually, as Miss Marple observed, simply standing motionless among the blooms, with an expression of profound distraction. The vicar's wife started visibly at Miss Marple's approach, suggesting a consciousness of guilt that transcended mere social awkwardness. "Constance, I wonder if we might speak privately," Miss Marple said gently. "Perhaps inside, where we won't be observed." In the vicar's study, with its leather-bound volumes and the faint smell of pipe tobacco that Edmund favored, Miss Marple settled into a chair with the deliberate slowness of someone who understood that apparent frailty often served as a useful disguise for focused observation. Constance, by contrast, moved with nervous energy, straightening objects that required no straightening and avoiding direct eye contact. "You were not surprised when the ring was discovered," Miss Marple began without preamble. "Your shock was performed rather than genuine. I noticed how quickly you recovered, how your distress transmuted into something else, something more akin to satisfaction, though you were careful to mask it beneath expressions of concern." "I don't know what you mean," Constance said, but her voice had lost its usual assertiveness. "I believe you do. You see, Constance, I've spent considerable time wondering why anyone would choose to reveal Ronald Cathcart's ring at such a specific moment, during Diana's engagement party, when all of Thornfield's attention would be focused not merely on the discovery itself, but on its implications regarding Diana's romantic history. And I began to understand the ring's placement was not designed to accuse Eleanor Blackwood of murder. It was designed to create scandal, to disrupt Diana's engagement, and to redirect everyone's attention toward questions of past relationships rather than present crimes. Constance finally looked directly at Miss Marple, and in her eyes the elderly woman saw a complex mixture of emotions, resentment, fear, and something that might almost have been admiration for having been perceived. "Diana was always the favorite," Constance said quietly, her voice containing a bitterness that had apparently accumulated across years. From the moment she was born, Edmund lavished attention upon her that he never extended to anyone else. I gave him a successful ministry. I hosted his charitable gatherings. I managed his household with impeccable precision, and yet all he truly desired was Diana's approval, Diana's success, Diana's happiness. When Ronald Cathcart threatened to disrupt her prospects through scandal, when a relationship with a man of questionable character threatened to compromise her standing in the village, I ensured that the situation was addressed. "You arranged for Ronald Cathcart's death," Miss Marple said, not as a question but as a statement of observed fact. "I arranged for his departure," Constance corrected. "Or rather, I arranged for assistance to be provided to someone who had considerably more compelling reasons to wish Ronald permanently removed from Thornfield. But I did not kill him myself. I merely facilitated the situation and ensured that the evidence, when it eventually surfaced, would direct suspicion toward Eleanor Blackwood, rather than toward the individual who actually committed the murder." "And who might that individual be?" Miss Marple inquired, though she believed she had already deduced the answer. "Someone who was protecting far more valuable interests than Diana's romantic prospects," Constance replied. "Someone who discovered that Ronald Cathcart's financial schemes posed a direct threat to their own security and reputation. Someone who realized that Ronald had acquired information capable of destroying everything they had constructed over decades. The implications crystallized with sudden clarity." Miss Marple rose from her chair with deliberate slowness and moved toward the vicar's desk, where various papers and documents lay in organized chaos. Among them, partially concealed beneath a leather appointment book, lay a bank statement bearing the name of Timothy Marsh Sr., the farmer whose payment from Ronald Cathcart had troubled his son, and who had suffered a conveniently timed cardiac episode immediately following Timothy Jr.'s investigation into his financial records. "Ronald Cathcart discovered your husband's involvement in his fraudulent schemes," Miss Marple said quietly. Ronald realized that Edmund, the respected vicar of Thornfield, had accepted money obtained through criminal activity. Ronald, perhaps motivated by conscience or perhaps by malice when his activities were exposed, threatened to reveal Edmund's complicity. And Edmund, facing the destruction of everything he had built, his reputation, his position, his standing in the community, decided that Ronald Cathcart represented an unacceptable risk. Edmund was not a violent man, Constance said, and there was genuine anguish in her voice. He was simply a man who had made one terrible mistake in a moment of financial desperation years earlier, and he was being threatened with exposure. I provided the means and the opportunity, but I did not provide the motive. "You provided the rationalization," Miss Marple corrected gently. "You made it possible for Edmund to view the elimination of Ronald Cathcart not as murder, but as protection of his daughter's future and the preservation of his ministry. And when Ronald was disposed of, you then took matters further by orchestrating the discovery of evidence designed to implicate Eleanor Blackwood, thereby ensuring that Edmund's involvement would never be examined too closely." Constance collapsed into a chair, her carefully maintained composure finally fracturing entirely. "I only wanted Diana to be happy. I only wanted Edmund to understand that I had protected what truly mattered. But he hasn't spoken to me since the ring was discovered. He's locked himself in the church, and he refuses to acknowledge that any of this was necessary." Miss Marple regarded the broken woman with the complex mixture of sympathy and clarity that came only from long experience with human weakness. "I believe you should summon Inspector Graves. The truth, however devastating, is preferable to the alternative you and your husband have constructed, And Edmu, ND, I suspect, is already prepared to confess, regardless of the consequences. The confession came not from Constance, but from Reverend Edmund Ashworth himself, who emerged from the church at dusk with the bearing of a man who had finally accepted the inevitability of his exposure. Inspector Graves, summoned by telephone from the vicar's house, arrived to find Edmund sitting on the stone bench beside the church door, his face bearing the particular exhaustion of someone who had wrestled with conscience and lost. The story that emerged, piece by painful, piece, revealed a crime far more psychologically intricate than the evidence alone had suggested. 5 years earlier, Edmund had indeed accepted a payment of £500 from Ronald Cathcart, ostensibly for his endorsement of various charitable investments, but actually in exchange for silence regarding financial schemes that Edmund had suspected were fundamentally dishonest. Edmund, faced with mounting parish expenses and personal financial pressures that had accumulated over years of modest ecclesiastical salary, had rationalized the acceptance as merely turning a blind eye rather than active participation. But Ronald, increasingly paranoid as his schemes began to unravel, had begun making references to Edmund's knowledge, to his complicity, to the potential scandal that would result from exposure. "He came to me 3 weeks before his disappearance," Edmund explained, his voice hollow and exhausted. "He said he was leaving England, that he was arranging for his brother's death to be investigated, that he intended to provide evidence of his financial operations to authorities. He suggested that my involvement, however peripheral, would be revealed in the process. He wasn't threatening me maliciously. He was simply stating facts with the terrible honesty of a man who had decided to confess everything." "And you decided," Miss Marple said quietly, though she had positioned herself at the periphery of the gathering, observing rather than interrogating, "that you could not allow that revelation to occur." "I didn't plan to kill him," Edmund said, and there was genuine anguish in his voice. "I simply invited him for a walk in the woods beyond the village, ostensibly to discuss settlement or alternative arrangements." We argued. He became increasingly adamant about his intention to expose everything. I was carrying a walking stick, nothing more. But in my panic, in my desperation, I struck him. Once, then again. It was not deliberate murder, Miss Marple. It was panic and desperation, and the terrible clarity of understanding that my entire existence was about to collapse. Inspector Graves recorded these details with professional efficiency, though even his methodical temperament seemed affected by the gravity of what Edmund was describing. The vicar continued, explaining how he had buried Ronald's body in the woods, hidden his jacket beneath the garden shed at Eleanor Blackwood's manor house in an attempt to create false evidence, and then attempted to live with the knowledge of what he had done for 5 years. "I thought it would fade," Edmund said. "I thought that with sufficient time and distance, I could convince myself that it had never happened. But then the garden party occurred, and Diana was celebrating her engagement, and I found myself unable to maintain the fiction that everything was normal. When Constance approached me that afternoon, when she suggested that she could arrange for the ring to surface and Eleanor to bear suspicion, I was too exhausted to resist. I allowed myself to be drawn further into deception, further into complicity. But the jacket, Miss Marple observed with characteristic precision. Constance revealed to me that she had orchestrated its discovery. Yet you are now taking responsibility for placing it at Eleanor's estate." Edmund met her eyes with the expression of someone confessing to sins beyond the original crime. "Constance did not place it. I did. I had kept it hidden for years, unable to destroy it, unable to properly dispose of evidence that represented what I had done. When I learned that Constance intended to reveal the ring, I realized that concealment was no longer possible. I placed the jacket at Eleanor's estate myself, ensuring that my involvement would be obscured by the appearance of deliberate framing. I was attempting to protect Diana by creating confusion, by ensuring that the investigation would be sufficiently complicated that careful examination of alternate suspects would delay discovery of my involvement." The confession continued into the evening, with Inspector Graves constructing an increasingly comprehensive understanding of events that revealed crime not as a single violent moment, but as a cascading series of decisions, rationalizations, and desperate attempts to manage consequences. Eleanor Blackwood, summoned to the vicar's house for this final accounting, received the revelation with a complex mixture of emotions: shock at the realization of her own nearly terminal danger, righteous indignation at having been manipulated, and something approaching sympathy for Edmund's obvious suffering. "I knew Ronald was involved in dubious activities," Eleanor explained to the assembled group, "but I had accepted that knowledge as the price of maintaining discretion about my own financial arrangements. Ronald had been useful to me, and I had been useful to him. We understood each other's limitations. I was horrified when he disappeared, certainly, but I also understood that in some circles, men who become liabilities simply cease to exist. I never suspected Edmund." Miss Marple, observing this exchange, noticed how Eleanor's expression shifted as full comprehension of events crystallized. Eleanor had been innocent of murder, but guilty of complicity through silence, a distinction that was legally significant but morally ambiguous. She had known more than she had revealed, had suspected more than she had acted upon, and had benefited from Ronald Cathcart's disappearance through the simple expedience of his no longer being available to expose her own questionable dealings. "What of Constance?" Inspector Graves asked, his practical mind attending to the remaining complications. "Constance acted with the intention of protecting Diana, and, I believe, with the intention of finally demonstrating to Edmund that she was capable of decisive action on behalf of their family," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "She did not kill Ronald Cathcart. She did not directly cause his death, but she did manipulate evidence and direct suspicion in ways designed to protect Edmund from discovery. Those actions constitute serious crimes, though of a different category than Edmund's. As evening descended fully upon Thornfield, and as Inspector Graves prepared to formally charge Reverend Edmund Ashworth with the murder of Ronald Cathcart, Miss Marple walked slowly toward her cottage. The village that had seemed so peaceful, so innocent just days earlier, had revealed itself to contain the same depths of human weakness and desperation that she had observed across decades of careful observation. The roses in the vicar's garden, she reflected, would continue to bloom regardless. Human nature, with all its complications and contradictions, remained eternally consistent. The arrest of Reverend Edmund Ashworth created a rupture in Thornfield's social fabric that would require years to properly mend. The vicar was removed from his position by ecclesiastical authorities within 48 hours, and the Church of England's legal representatives began the complex process of addressing the criminal and canonical implications of his actions. Yet it was not Edmund's downfall that occupied Miss Marple's thoughts as she sat in her garden the morning following his confession. It was the question of Constance, whose actions remained legally unresolved and morally ambiguous. Inspector Graves arrived at Miss Marple's cottage shortly after breakfast, carrying with him the particular combination of frustration and deference that suggested he had reached the limits of his procedural certainty. He settled into her offered chair with the air of a man consulting an oracle rather than a colleague. "The difficulty," Graves explained, "is determining precisely what charges to bring against Constance Ashworth. She clearly manipulated evidence and directed investigation toward an innocent party. But she did not kill Ronald Cathcart, nor did she actively conceal evidence of Edmund's crime. He had already concealed the body before she became aware of the full circumstances. She merely orchestrated the revelation of evidence in a manner designed to implicate Eleanor Blackwood rather than her husband. You are asking whether her actions constitute criminal obstruction of justice or whether they fall into a more ambiguous category of interfering with police investigation," Miss Marple observed calmly. "The legal distinction is important, but the psychological distinction is equally significant. What motivated Constance, Inspector, was not love of Edmund so much as resentment of Diana." "I don't follow," Graves admitted. Constance had spent decades in service to her husband's ministry and his position in the community, Miss Marple explained. She had organized charitable events, hosted social gatherings, managed a household with considerable skill. Yet Edmund's attention, his affection, his pride, these were reserved almost exclusively for Diana. When Ronald Cathcart threatened to compromise Diana's prospects through scandal, Constance saw an opportunity. She could protect Diana in a manner that would finally demonstrate to Edmund how essential her own role was to his well-being and his reputation. By manipulating evidence and directing suspicion toward Eleanor Blackwood, Graves said slowly, understanding crystallizing in his expression. By ensuring that when the crime was eventually discovered, it would appear that Constance had taken decisive action to protect her family, Miss Marple corrected gently. She did not anticipate that her own manipulations would lead directly to Edmund's confession. She believed herself to be sufficiently clever to have permanently obscured his involvement while directing suspicion toward a woman whose financial dealings were questionable enough to make her a plausible suspect. Over the following week, as legal proceedings advanced and various depositions were recorded, additional layers of complexity emerged. Eleanor Blackwood retained a solicitor and initiated proceedings to recover damages for false accusation, effectively ensuring that the question of her own dubious financial dealings would be examined in considerable detail. Timothy Marsh Sr., confronted by his son regarding the suspicious payment he had received years earlier, finally provided explanation. He had indeed been complicit in Ronald Cathcart's schemes, though in a peripheral capacity that had not involved active fraud, but rather the provision of land access for purposes he had chosen not to examine too closely. It was Timothy Sr.'s cardiac episode, Miss Marple realized, that had inadvertently contributed to the case's resolution. The stress of potential exposure, combined with his son's investigations, had forced a physical crisis that had rendered him incapable of maintaining the careful distance he had cultivated from his own complicity. Fear of death, Miss Marple reflected, often accomplished what fear of legal consequences could not. Diana Ashworth, meanwhile, had retreated from public view, and the engagement to Robert Winslow had been quietly dissolved. Inspector Graves informed Miss Marple that Diana had taken a position as a teacher in a girls' school in Cornwall, apparently seeking to distance herself from Thornfield and all its associations. Whether her scion represented genuine desire for a fresh beginning, or simply an attempt to escape the tainted legacy of her family's crimes, remained unclear. Though Miss Marple suspected the truth encompassed both motivations in complicated measure. "What troubles me," Miss Marple said to Margaret Blackwell during one of their customary afternoon conversations, "is that Constance genuinely believed she was protecting Diana. She had constructed a narrative in which her manipulation of evidence was justified by the greater good of preserving her daughter's prospects. It is a common rationalization, I find. The transformation of self-interest into apparent altruism through sufficiently sophisticated psychological reframing. Do you believe Constance should face criminal charges?" Margaret asked directly. "I believe," Miss Marple replied carefully, "that the law must apply consistent standards regardless of motivation. But I also recognize that Constance's actions, while obstructive and manipulative, did not directly cause Ronald Cathcart's death. She capitalized upon a tragedy that had already occurred. That distinction may prove significant in how the courts eventually address her culpability. In the end, Constance Ashworth accepted a plea bargain that resulted in conviction for obstruction of justice and perverting the course of justice, with a suspended sentence contingent upon 5 years probation. The vicar's wife had lost her position, her home, and her standing in the community, though not her liberty. She relocated to an unremarkable town in the Midlands, where she apparently maintained the lowest possible public profile while attempting to reconstruct some semblance of ordinary existence. Edmund Ashworth, by contrast, faced trial for murder. The case was relatively straightforward. He had confessed extensively. The physical evidence was consistent with his account and his M.O. Tithe was demonstrable. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, though his age and the circumstances of the crime resulted in his being eligible for parole after 15 years. Miss Marple, who attended portions of the trial, observed how thoroughly the man in the dock differed from the conscientious clergyman she had known for decades. Prison had already begun its work of transformation, reducing Edmund to something diminished and fundamentally altered. As autumn descended upon Thornfield, Miss Marple found herself reflecting upon the nature of human deception and the vast distance that often separated public presentation from private reality. The village that had seemed so innocent, so unchanging in its peaceful rhythms, had revealed itself to contain the same complexities and moral ambiguities that characterized every human community. The roses continued to bloom, indifferent to human tragedy. The church bells continued to ring, though now with a new vicar whose past contained no such complications. And life, in that peculiar way that it possessed, gradually adjusted to accommodate the absence of those who had departed. 3 months after Edmund Ashworth's conviction, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor on a cold November afternoon. Diana Ashworth, having apparently returned to Thornfield for reasons she did not immediately explain, sat in Miss Marple's sitting room with the careful posture of someone uncertain whether she would be welcomed. The young woman had aged noticeably since the garden party, not merely in physical appearance, though her face had acquired sharper lines and her eyes had lost something of their former brightness, but in a more fundamental sense that suggested experiences capable of mattering profoundly. "I came back to thank you," Diana began without preamble, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Though I'm not certain way." "The gratitude is the appropriate response. You exposed my father as a murderer. You orchestrated the revelation of my mother's complicity. You ensured that everything I believed about my family was revealed to be constructed upon deception." "I exposed what was true," Miss Marple replied gently. "Whether that truth should be received with gratitude or with anger depends, I suspect, upon your own assessment of what truth matters more, the comfortable fiction of your parents' integrity or the complicated reality of their humanity." Diana's expression shifted, and for a moment Miss Marple observed the struggle between anger and understanding that played across the younger woman's face. "My father killed a man. My mother knowingly manipulated evidence. And yet I find myself unable to hate them as thoroughly as I believe I should." "Is that weakness, Miss Marple? Is that a failure of moral clarity?" "It is," Miss Marple said carefully, "the natural consequence of loving people while simultaneously recognizing their capacity for moral failure. Your parents are not abstract representations of good or evil. They are complicated human beings who made terrible choices under circumstances that were psychologically intolerable to them. That understanding does not excuse their actions, but it does contextualize them in ways that permit compassion without requiring moral compromise." Diana remained silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed upon some point beyond Miss Marple's sitting room, apparently contemplating the philosophical architecture that might permit simultaneous recognition of her parents' crimes and her continued love for them as individuals. "Robert Winslow wrote to me," Diana eventually said. "He explained that he had broken our engagement not from anger at my parents' actions, but because he recognized that continuing our relationship would inevitably complicate my process of coming to terms with what had occurred. He was, I believe, both tactful and genuinely wise in his judgment. A man capable of such perception is rare," Miss Marple observed. "Did his letter suggest any continued romantic interest once you had processed these events?" "It suggested patience," Diana replied, "and perhaps something more, though I suspect I am not prepared to pursue romantic entanglement at present. I came back to Thornfield not to reclaim my life here, but to understand how the life I believed I possessed could have been so fundamentally built upon deception. My father was a murderer living among people who respected him. My mother was someone capable of manipulating evidence to protect her own interests while claiming to act from maternal devotion, and I was someone who did not perceive any of this. The failure of perception," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "is not unique to you. Human beings are generally quite adept at failing to perceive what we do not wish to acknowledge. We construct narratives that permit us to function within our social circles while simultaneously managing uncomfortable truths. It is a psychological necessity rather than a moral failure." Diana visited Miss Marple again several times during that autumn, each visit extending the conversation further into the psychological landscape of family trauma and recovery. Through these interactions, Miss Marple observed Diana's gradual transformation from a woman broken by revelations into a woman attempting to construct a more authentic understanding of herself and her family. It was not a simple process, nor was it linear. Diana cycled through periods of anger, forgiveness, renewed anger, and a more nuanced understanding that transcended simple moral judgment. "I have decided to remain as a teacher," Diana confessed during one of their final conversations. "Not in Cornwall, but here in Thornfield, at the village school. I realize that may seem impossible. Returning to a community that knows precisely what my parents did, that will forever associate my name with their crimes. But I also recognize that hiding accomplishes nothing. Living openly with the consequences of my family's actions, establishing new relationships based on authentic rather than performed identity, seems the only path toward genuine recovery." Miss Marple observed Diana's resolution with quiet approval. The young woman had moved beyond victimhood without abandoning moral clarity. She had achieved a form of grace that did not excuse her parents' actions, but permitted her to continue loving them as flawed human beings, rather than as abstractions of evil. By the time winter firmly established itself in Thornfield, Diana had indeed begun teaching at the village school, and, contrary to the social ostracism that might have been anticipated, she was gradually received with something approaching normality. The village's collective memory, Miss Marple reflected, possessed a remarkable capacity for accommodation. Scandal faded into history far more quickly than one might suppose, particularly when the person most directly affected by that scandal demonstrated willingness to engage in authentic social participation rather than retreating into defensiveness or shame. Eleanor Blackwood, meanwhile, had redirected her considerable financial resources toward the establishment of a charitable fund designed to support victims of financial fraud, an action that suggested she had processed her own near tragedy into something approaching purposeful redirection. Whether this represented genuine moral transformation or merely sophisticated image rehabilitation, Miss Marple could not definitively determine. But she had learned over decades that human motivation was sufficiently complex that recategorization of action into exclusively selfish or altruistic components was rarely possible. The case of Ronald Cathcart and the crimes it had exposed gradually became integrated into Thornfield's collective history, referenced occasionally, examined periodically, but no longer consuming the village's attention. Life, in that resilient way that human communities possessed, had adjusted itself to accommodate the absence of Reverend Edmund Ashworth and continued forward with the particular momentum that characterized small English villages, and Miss Marple, observing all of this with her characteristic quiet attention, reflected upon the eternal truth that appeared in the details of every human community, that the most profound crimes emerged not from inherent depravity, but from the terrible intersection of human weakness, psychological desperation, and the capacity for rationalization that permitted good people to justify terrible actions. The following spring brought a remarkable discovery that would necessitate a final recalibration of the Cathcart case, not in terms of Edmund's guilt, which remained absolute, but in terms of the fuller context of Ronald Cathcart's life and the various circumstances that had culminated in his death. It was Timothy Marsh Sr., facing his own mortality with the clarity that advanced age and cardiac vulnerability imposed, who provided the crucial information. On his deathbed in late March, attended by his son and a local physician, Timothy Sr. finally unburdened himself of the complete truth regarding his involvement with Ronald Cathcart's schemes. "Ronald came to me because he required someone with legitimate access to agricultural land," Timothy explained, his voice weakened by illness, but still capable of conveying the weight of long-suppressed secrets. He and his brother Charles were engaged in something that required esalati, privacy, and geographic access that wouldn't raise suspicion. In exchange for allowing them to use the far reaches of my property for specific purposes, I deliberately chose not to examine too closely. I received monthly payments that I did not declare to tax authorities. "What purposes?" Miss Marple asked gently, having been invited to this deathbed accounting by Timothy Jr., who recognized that the elderly woman's presence might facilitate truthfulness more effectively than familial pressure. I believed them to be related to smuggling, or perhaps the storage of goods obtained through questionable channels, Timothy admitted. But I later came to suspect something far more serious. Charles Cathcart, I discovered, had been involved in investment fraud that extended across multiple European countries. Ronald had apparently attempted to distance himself from that enterprise, but Charles's sudden death, which I had always accepted as accidental, began to seem considerably more questionable once I understood the scope of their criminal involvement. Inspector Graves, when informed of this deathbed revelation, initiated a retrospective examination of Charles Cathcart's death records. What emerged was disturbing in its implications. Charles's motor accident in London had been officially recorded as accidental, but certain details suggested it might have been deliberately engineered. The investigation stalled when contemporary records proved insufficient to support criminal charges against any surviving individual. But it did establish that Ronald Cathcart had potential motives far more complex than anyone had previously acknowledged. Ronald may have been attempting to distance himself from criminal enterprises in which his brother remained deeply involved, Inspector Graves explained to Miss Marple during one of their final consultations regarding the case. He may have feared that Charles's exposure would implicate him as well. He may have even believed himself responsible for Charles's death in some oblique way. These psychological pressures, combined with his obvious nervousness about exposure and his explicit statements to Edmund about his intention to confess everything, suggest a man in profound psychological distress, which does not excuse Edmund's actions, Miss Marple observed, but does contextualize them more fully. Ronald was not simply a man attempting to blackmail Edmund. He was a man caught within a criminal enterprise who had apparently decided that confession and exposure represented his only path towards psychological survival. Edmund, perceiving only the threat to his own position, eliminated that threat without genuinely understanding Ronald's actual circumstances or motivations. This fuller understanding of Ronald Cathcart's psychological state prompted certain reconsiderations among those who had known him. Eleanor Blackwood, when questioned about the nature of Ronald's apparent emotional distress in the months preceding his death, reluctantly acknowledged that Ronald had made several references to feeling trapped between loyalty to his brother and conscience regarding their mutual criminal activities. He spoke of wanting to begin again, Eleanor recalled, her expression suggesting she was accessing memories she had previously chosen not to examine. He mentioned feeling exhausted by deception. I interpreted these statements as merely the temporary melancholy of a man reconsidering his life choices. I did not recognize them as signs of someone approaching genuine psychological crisis. By May, when spring had fully established itself, and the village gardens were once again bursting with the particular greenery that made Thornfield appear almost artificially picturesque, Miss Marple found herself reflecting upon the case's ultimate resolution with the satisfaction of someone who had perceived essential truths, but also with a certain sadness regarding the multiple tragedies that had accumulated across its investigation. Ronald Cathcart had been a man attempting to escape criminal entanglement and psychological corruption. Edmund Ashworth had been a man so terrified of exposure that he had committed murder to prevent it. Constance had been a woman so desperate for acknowledgement that she had orchestrated evidence manipulation to demonstrate her essential value to her family. And Thornfield itself had been a community so invested in surface civility that it had failed to perceive the desperation and moral compromise festering beneath its picturesque exterior. Diana, arriving at Miss Marple's cottage on a particularly fine May afternoon, brought word that Robert Winslow had written to her again, this time with explicit romantic intentions, now that sufficient time had passed for her to process her family's crimes and establish herself as an autonomous individual capable of building relationships upon authentic, rather than inherited identity. "I believe I shall accept his courtship," Diana said, and Miss Marple observed how genuinely her smile reflected authentic happiness rather than performed contentment. "He has demonstrated patience and genuine understanding of circumstances entirely beyond his control. That seems a reasonable foundation for building something that might genuinely endure. Love constructed upon authentic understanding of one's partner's complexities is considerably more durable than love built upon illusions. Miss Marple agreed. Your parents' marriage, I suspect, was built upon mutual dependency and certain convenient fictions about one another's moral integrity. What you are building with Robert, should you choose to proceed, has the advantage of Bane. Grounded in reality rather than in carefully maintained deceptions, as evening descended and Diana departed, Miss Marple sat in her garden amid the blooming roses and considered the full trajectory of events that had transformed Thornfield from a village of pleasant surfaces into a community forced to acknowledge its own depths of human complexity. The roses would continue to bloom regardless of human moral failure. The seasons would continue their rotation, and Thornfield, having been shaken by genuine tragedy, would gradually resettle into the comfortable rhythms of village life, incorporating these events into its collective history while gradually relegating them to the status of stories that had happened to previous versions of itself. The final resolution of the Cathcart case came not through dramatic courtroom revelation or last-minute evidence, but through the accumulation of understanding that gradually transformed the crime from a singular act of violence into a complex tragedy encompassing multiple lives and intersecting moral failures. By summer, when Thornfield had largely returned to its customary rhythms and the immediate scandal had begun to fade into historical memory, Miss Marple received a formal visit from Inspector Graves, bearing what he described as closure regarding certain outstanding questions. Edmund Ashworth, in a lengthy correspondence from his prison cell, had apparently requested that certain details be communicated to Miss Marple, details he felt she alone would understand and contextualize appropriately. The letters revealed a man who had spent months in solitary contemplation, attempting to reconstruct the psychological processes that had led him from a respectable ecclesiastical position to deliberate homicide. "I have come to understand," Edmund had written, "that my crime was not truly about Ronald Cathcart at all. It was about the accumulation of small moral compromises that had gradually transformed me from the idealistic young clergyman I once was into someone capable of accepting criminal payment and living with that knowledge daily. Ronald's threat of exposure was not merely a threat to my position. It was a mirror forcing me to acknowledge what I had become, and I could not bear that acknowledgement, so I eliminated the source of reflection rather than confronting the reality it revealed. This acknowledgement of Edmund's own psychological transformation provided," Miss Marple reflected, "a crucial understanding of how good people committed terrible acts. It was not through inherent depravity, but through the gradual erosion of moral boundaries occasioned by small decisions that each seemed individually defensible until they accumulated into fundamental corruption. The investigation into Charles Cathcart's death, meanwhile, had yielded unexpected results when an elderly woman in London came forward, claiming to possess information about events surrounding the accident. She had been Charles Cathcart's mistress, and she revealed that Charles had been murdered, deliberately driven off a road, by individuals connected to the international fraud network he had been attempting to dismantle. Ronald's subsequent anxiety and his explicit statements about wanting to confess everything had apparently been driven not merely by conscience, but by fear that those responsible for his brother's death would target him as well. Ronald knew who had killed his brother, Miss Marple mused aloud to Margaret Blackwell during one of their final conversations about the case. He understood that his own knowledge represented a danger, and he had decided that confessing everything to authorities represented his only possible escape from that danger. Edmund, perceiving only the threat to his own position, never recognized that Ronald was attempting to achieve salvation through exposure. The tragic irony was profound. Edmund had eliminated a man who was already fleeing the very criminal enterprise that Edmund himself had peripherally supported. Ronald's death had prevented not merely Edmund's exposure, but also the exposure of the international fraud network and the men responsible for Charles Cathcart's murder. In eliminating Ronald, Edmund had inadvertently protected the true criminals and ensured that justice for Charles's death would never be achieved through proper legal channels. As autumn approached once more, exactly 1 year after Ronald Cathcart's ring had surfaced in the vicar's garden, Thornfield had achieved a new equilibrium. Diana and Robert Winslow had become formally engaged, with a wedding planned for the following spring. Eleanor Blackwood's charitable foundation was distributing significant resources to fraud victims across England. Timothy Marsh Sr. had died peacefully in summer, his deathbed confessions having apparently provided him sufficient moral absolution to face his final moments with acceptance rather than anxiety. And Edmund Ashworth remained in prison, seemingly reconciled to his fate and engaged in correspondence with a prison chaplain who had apparently recognized in the disgraced clergyman a capacity for genuine spiritual transformation born from authentic moral recognition rather than mere ecclesiastical performance. Miss Marple herself, now in her 84th year, found herself approaching the Cathcart case with the perspective of someone who had observed human nature across sufficient decades to recognize patterns that repeated themselves endlessly across different contexts and circumstances. The specific details of Thornfield's tragedy were unique, but the fundamental architecture of how good people committed terrible acts remained consistent. The accumulation of moral compromise, the desperation born from fear of exposure, the rationalization that permitted terrible actions to be perceived as necessary protective measures. On a particular October afternoon, as the village green displayed the particular golden quality that English autumn provided, Miss Marple sat in her garden and reflected upon the nature of justice and redemption. Edmund would spend years in prison, possibly decades. Constance had been released after her probationary period and was apparently living quietly in the Midlands, building some form of existence grounded in anonymity rather than social prominence. Eleanor had transformed her near tragedy into purposeful charitable work. Diana and Robert were building a marriage upon authentic mutual understanding rather than the convenient fictions that had characterized her parents' union. And Ronald Cathcart, the precipitating figure whose mysterious disappearance had set all these events in motion, remained in some fundamental sense unsolved, not in terms of who had killed him or why, but in terms of who he truly was. The various accounts of him suggested a man of considerable complexity, criminal and conscience-stricken, desperate and ambitious, trapped between loyalty to his brother and recognition of their mutual moral corruption. Human nature, Miss Marple said quietly to herself, her needles clicking with the steady rhythm that had accompanied her observations across 8 decades, is neither good nor evil, but eternally, infinitely complicated. We contain within ourselves capacities for both profound moral clarity and profound self-deception. The question is not whether we are capable of terrible acts, but whether, having committed them, we possess the courage to acknowledge what we have become. The roses in her garden had begun to fade with approaching winter, their petals dropping onto the earth from which they had grown. In spring they would bloom again, indifferent to human moral complexity, continuing their ancient cycles while human communities attempted, with varying degrees of success, to achieve justice and redemption from the terrible consequences of their own choices.